Well, hi, everybody. Welcome to the Drawing Database. I'm Professor Mark Leone coming to you, and I've got a great treat today. I've got a former grad student and one of my favorite colleagues here with Mary Porterfield. Mary comes to us live here from Chicago, Illinois, and she's going to give a lecture today on her work, both drawing and painting. And let me give you a little bit of background on her education, and we'll go from there. So Mary Porterfield comes to us with an MFA from Arizona State University from Tempe, Arizona, which is where we met and worked together and had a fantastic time, I must say. And then also she has an MS in occupational therapy from Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri, a wonderful university. And then also lastly, in these varied degrees, a BS in biology from Doane College in Crete, Nebraska. So that is an amazing series of accomplishments. So with that, Mary, I'd like to say welcome. And when you're ready, we're honored to have you here and look forward to the talk. Take it away.
Okay. Well, Mark, I just want to thank you for having me. I so respected you in grad school, and I continue to respect all you've done as an artist. And I know the program you built up at NKU is absolutely wonderful. So it's an honor to be a part of this.
Awesome. Thank you, dear. I appreciate it.
I am always honest to a T. So with that, I'm going to have this talk be more or less a full circle, beginning of what I started with in grad school. This was the first drawing I did when I entered Arizona State. And I went there with the idea that I wanted to do work commemorating the elderly. Working as an occupational therapist, I've always been touched by what the circumstances of the aged endure in terms of physical loss, the emotional loss of losing loved ones. So I wanted to begin this series. I really didn't know what direction it would head towards, but I've been especially intrigued by patients I've worked with who have had Alzheimer's disease. So in this early drawing, I covered it with pastel, worked back into it with white chalk, and erased parts of the figure because I was thinking with Alzheimer's disease, a lot of those patients, they lose sight of where they are and even who they are. And many of them might walk in circles. They call it wandering. And I wanted to address those aspects in my work. And then I have to share this. My grandmother for years was my model. She did not have Alzheimer's until I would say 97. Age 97, she broke her hip and
Wow.
suffered a
Amazing.
physical decline, and she
Right.
didn't have the cognition level that she had previously, but she did well for a long time. And she was very happy and open to be my model. And the pictures on the left, I photographed in her kitchen. The pictures on the right, I would go home from Arizona State. I'd visit her in Nebraska, and she would lay on a blanket on the bottom of her basement stairs. And then I would stand at the top of the stairs and photograph her at different angles to get different perspectives. Because it seemed to me if I were really going to address the issues of Alzheimer's disease, I should have alternate perspectives because their minds, the mind of someone with dementia is working on a chaotic level. And there are different perspectives that those patients are seeing. So I developed this interest with this drawing, and I was also thinking about how in nursing homes they often lack natural light. A lot of these patients are in one room, sometimes with a roommate. They're unable to go outside. So I was using, pure black and layering and playing with the perspectives. Sometimes what's in back became smaller, or what's in back became larger, what's in front became smaller. I played with reality because I felt like their brains were in some cases no longer working in a more or less a typical realm. And I've always been fascinated by the use of symbolism and metaphor. So many times in nursing homes, patients are there for their final days. So I use the imagery of vultures to represent that terminal nature of what they face, but also birds to represent that freedom, it being able to leave and walk and run and go different places. And that was denied these individuals.
Right. I would almost say too, Mary, looking at that work, just the way we set up in this country, our nursing homes, the vulture symbolism is even more potent given the exploitive nature that we've often seen nursing homes in the way they're run, exploiting the last days of financially those that are afflicted. So I think that's even more prescient, now than it was, back when you were creating these works.
That's a great point. And I don't think at the time I really thought as much about the financial aspects, but that's definitely something that happens where patients, when they have dementia, they can be taken advantage of, and the placement may not be the best, and they don't have the cognizance to realize that. So you're absolutely right. And with all these works, at least, being taken away from your home and being placed in this foreign environment was really on my mind. And this piece from grad school, I was thinking too, when you're bedbound, and my dad faced this in his last months, but when you're bedbound, what you really see are hands coming towards you, hands that might be feeding you, bathing you, toileting you, but that can often be frightening. And I was playing with that idea along with snakes represent constriction, and using a pattern, thinking of that sometimes these patients are equated to a pattern where every one person might be treated as another, and the specificness of identity can be lost. Um, and this is a detail of that image. And at the time I was using a palette knife. And for those students that are listening, I loved thick textured paint, but looking back on these, I do feel that there's a sense of monotony because I use the palette knife so in such a repetitive way. I did get really good at feedback from my instructors about varying my paint, and that took a very long time. It's something I still work towards, but that was good advice that they gave me. But I look back on these and I could see the need for more variance. I was trying to achieve that by placing tape and putting it down and lifting it away, and using stencils, but still there's a repetitiveness of the impasto marks that I was making. And then I know, Mark, you did this also, but I taught at Arizona State as the teaching color theory. As graduate students, we were given the opportunity to teach a class, and the first class I was given was color. So even though I was using black previously to represent the absence of natural light, teaching color theory, I realized, wow, there's so much more I can say with these works. There's color can be so emotive. So I went back and started with this analogous color scheme, trying to select colors that might also represent the mood of being taken out of your home and being put in a foreign environment, and not and slowly losing the cognition that you might have had prior.
I
Um,
almost also in that last image, almost what happens when all of us, but especially elderly, when they fall or they injure, the blood clotting, the bluish, grayish, greenish, the bruising that can happen in a very, what we might seem as a very gentle touch, but they're so fragile at times, physically. That starts to remind me of the way the skin reacts when bones break or there's a contusion of minor significance that can become major too as well.
that's a great point. I never thought about that. That's a really good point. Absolutely right.
It's great to see these as you're going through, and I had the luxury and the privilege to see them in process, and how, for those of the audience, those of you who are wanting to go to grad school, how our studios, we were on that let's see, north side, close to the back then Fiesta Bowl in the stadium, and how we would come by and see how we're doing, check in every so often, and is it going well, is it not going so well, and all our trials and tribulations, and how that community, that culture, built into what we did. And just, it jogs my memory back to that long narrow studio that you had on the other side of and the weird one I had with a double room there.
Yep.
It's fascinating to see it all coming back. And this is pretty still early in your graduate school output, correct?
Yes, this was after the completion of 1 year, and it was a 3-year program, and I was just kind of figuring things out of where I wanted to take the series, and thinking more about, and that kind of leads into this next work, how when someone has dementia, how from a distance their mind and they might appear so normal, but then it's when you converse with them and you spend more time with that individual, you can see that their minds are working on a really chaotic level. So this was done just after that last piece, and it's when I had that epiphany in that summer where I thought, if I'm trying to really paint about the issue, the topic of dementia or Alzheimer's, I want my paintings to be similar to that disease, and that from a distance there's an illusion of normality, and then up close they're very chaotic. So then I took those images of my grandmother and I layered them within these scenes of nature. And I it took me a while to figure this out, but after leaving graduate school, I did a lot of like soul searching, and I realized that I kept going to these scenes from nature because they represented those elements beyond my control. The best of therapy isn't going to take away dementia, and it was a struggle as a young therapist and being very idealized in my profession, thinking I could always make a difference. But there's certain things that unfortunately you can't change. And I continued to explore metaphor. I used stencils, as you could see, to vary the paint. I was working on wood panel because that allowed me to get more incised marks with the palette knife. And this too is something that I realized later, but some of the paint is scraped away. And I think on some level, I was trying to show how the individuals I was painting, they were becoming more um, a ghost of the person they had been in the past. So scraping the paint away represented their gradual loss, in their terms of their physicality and their skill level that they had previously. Although I don't think I know I didn't realize that at the time.
Mary, can you give us give our audience a size dimension so they'll get a feeling of how small or large these are?
Yeah, thank you, Mark. This is probably around 6 feet tall, and I would say this one might be I want to say over 4 feet wide, at least, possibly larger, but they're pretty good sized paintings because I wanted them seen in a larger space where you could walk back, say, several hundred feet and see a landscape. And then as you walk closer and closer and closer, you see the chaos reveal itself. And the fish might be a little bit of an odd metaphor, but I had done volunteer work on an Alzheimer's unit, and I noticed that some of the patients would walk continually in circles. And sometimes when I would watch fish swim in an aquarium, they continually swim in circles, they follow each other. And it kind of reminded me of that cyclical pattern of walking that they call wandering. So that's more or less where this concept came from. And I wanted each painting to be a different aspect of the disease, where the last one was more a sense of trepidation or fear, where this one might be that sense of bliss. And as hard as it is to admit, there are moments then having memory loss could be a blessing, in the sense that you don't realize the hardships you're facing. There are moments of joy. There are moments that you feel as a laughter, a smile. They might be fleeting in nature, but they do occur. So I wanted to address that with this work. And this is a detail of that. And you can kind of see, if you look close, you can see the grains of the wood in the detail.
And again, these are extremely labor intensive. For our audience, my students in YouTube land, give us an example, or give us some kind of an idea, if you would, about the amount of labor for each particular image, or just in general. I
feel like this size, which I know is over 4 feet, I think each piece took at least 6 weeks, and I would set goals for myself. I would be, I want to paint 20 figures a day, and that was about a good 8 hours worth of work. And I look back and I actually regret that way of working. I no longer work that way. I'm not so methodical, and I feel, for me, recently, art is a lot more enjoyable. But at that time, I put so much pressure on myself to get so much done every day.
Yeah.
And part of that was because I kept working weekends at a hospital. So I only had Monday through Friday to work on my art. So I put an enormous amount of pressure to put in, 8-hour days, so many days a week, and paint so many figures. And I remember, you might recall this, Mark, but I would have I would make little marks on my studio wall. Every time I painted a figure, I made a line. So I would say, okay, how close am I to doing 20, my goal? And
Yeah.
yeah, I wish I wasn't like that, looking back, but that's where I was at the time. And
I kind of personally, I love that. It's your job, and you were tenacious and just wonderfully focused. And for our audience and our students at NKU and SOTA and School of the Arts, it's amazing that she had this full-time professional job while going to graduate school, and then paying for education, and it's extremely respectful what you were able to accomplish, and also have a major substantial and oftentimes stressful job. I remember when we first started out, I was spending about 80 hours a week in the studio, and then as graduates, as we got more mature with what we were doing, that waned some, and probably down to 40, which is more reasonable, because you're balancing all kinds of work life issues, and doing this potent difficult work, mentally exhaustive and emotionally. So the amount of energy and tenacity is remarkable, and I think they've aged well. I think there's just the remembrance part of this, and I remember them in the gallery, and they're wonderfully, in some ways, when you do step back, like you were saying, so simple and so effective as thumbnails, and you come upon them, and there's this amazing amount of chaotic uh, energy to them, in this vortex of worlds that come through, that is certainly to be commended.
thank you. Thank you so much. And there's something about my career too that really played into these also. Um, I'm going to fast forward through this slide because it's a little bit blurry. But when I started off working as an occupational therapist, my first job was at St. Louis University Hospital, and I was responsible for assessing elderly patients that showed early signs of dementia and determining if they were safe to live at home or if they should go on to another supervised setting, such as a nursing home. And me being the detailed person I was, I did these very long, involved evaluations. They would take sometimes 3 days to do. And a lot of my evaluations were used as the basis by social work and the doctors to then discharge these patients to a nursing home. And I think, to be brutally honest, a lot of these works from my own guilt, feeling that I had a role in sentencing these patients, these environments. I knew I made the right professional decision, but it was a very conflicted decision. I knew they were safer in the nursing home, but I felt like I played a role in them leaving their home environment if they were very comfortable. So I
Mm-hmm.
think that's also another reason I was just so driven by this series,
Mm-hmm.
and this work. And I think that's what held me for so long. I felt like maybe making these paintings and paying tribute to them was my way of acknowledging my part and allowing these patients to be remembered, even though they may have been forgotten in their immediate setting. Um, so I'm sorry, I pushed the wrong button here. And I did get good feedback upon leaving graduate school. We had an amazing teacher, Janice Pitsley, that taught drawing. And I remember her saying to me, our last critique, she said, Mary, your works can be so much stronger if you invent your landscapes, invent the imagery, take us to even a newer place. So this was my first image, other than, of course, the photographs I took of my grandmother, where it was entirely out of my mind. And I thought that was just a really great piece of feedback to be given. It's definitely a lot harder, but I'm a lot more proud of the end result, knowing it's invented from start to finish.
Mm-hmm.
And that relates, all of that kind of feeds into this quote and by William Kentridge. I think you were a fan of his work too, Mark, but
Oh yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
when you spend a day or two drawing an object or image, there's a sympathy towards that object embodied in human labor of making. And I do think my guilt over feeling that I evaluated these patients and played a role in them going to nursing homes, I really think my, several years of grad school devoting to this topic, I think that was my way of trying to increase my own sympathy and more awareness of what they might have gone through. And I feel like this quote just really nailed so much of how I feel. And then after leaving graduate school, I think for those of the students listening, one thing I highly recommend is just keep getting feedback, keep having people over to your studio. During the pandemic, I had Zoom meetings with different curators. I'm having this wonderful opportunity with Mark right now. But upon leaving graduate school, I reached out to the curator of the Scottsdale Museum of Contemporary Art. The curator at the time was Deborah Hopkins, and she came to my studio and she said, remember that the more personal you make something, the more universal it becomes. And that single quote has really guided what I'm doing presently. It shined light a lot on what I had been doing with the Alzheimer's patients, feeling, I played a role in their living situation. And that led then to this really a new series of work and really questioning more about why I made the work I did. And so the figures became younger in the sense I was putting my own thoughts into these works. And so I had dancers being caught up in this giant wave, because that's how I felt as a therapist, that I was seeing these situations I couldn't escape from, that I was really caught up in this cycle of seeing diagnoses and diseases that were heartbreaking. And it was hard to let them go at the end of the day. So this painting is entitled Ballerinas in Buffalo. I switched from working on wood panel on this one to working on canvas and using more brushwork, because I wanted still to vary my paint, which was that great piece of advice that my instructors gave me. And then they got a little darker because I went even deeper into these concepts. And first, I was raised in a very religious background. I was raised Catholic. My mom goes to church every day. And if I even dived even deeper, a lot of these works were just about my own guilt over not making a difference when I wanted to have an effect, guilt over not being able to live up to these very unrealistic expectations I had for myself in healthcare, guilt, not being able to accept those diseases and situations that I couldn't change. So you see Catholic iconography in the lower parts of this painting, the crevices, because I felt like that was really sort of guiding a lot of what was troubling me in terms of, feeling so sad about not being able to live up to these saint-like expectations that I had for myself. And I know for the students watching, a big question is, how do I construct a painting? How do I do it from beginning to end? So this is the beginning of a painting. I went back to painting on wood panel. I just enjoyed it more, and I would do an underpainting with acrylic after gessoing the wood, and then I would methodically draw with fine charcoal a lot of hundreds of multi-figured narratives, and the narratives became a little more complex than they were in graduate school. They weren't just figures of the elderly juxtaposed against animals. I was starting to combine narratives representing my own guilt, aspects of my upbringing, images of Catholic iconography, images of my patients, images of a younger person turning away, wanting to separate herself, other images where I'm completely involved and trying to make a difference where a difference may not be able to be made. And this is the final image. This one took quite a while. I think this is close to 6 feet. I want to say this may have taken at least 6 months, maybe up to a year to do. And this is a detail. And a lot of these images, it's about those same types of themes, it's just trying to invent my own imagery. This is the detail of that. Still using a palette knife, but in other areas using brushwork. I'm more proud of this one because I remember in grad school hearing that it's incredibly hard to create versatility with your painting. And that was always a weakness of mine. And I felt like this painting, it more or less came together, where the inner geyser, which is all inventive, was done more with glaze, and parts of the figures disappear. And the outside areas were done largely with the palette knife, but there were other areas where I transitioned it into brushwork. On top of the plateaus are figures of saints, because when I was young, my bedtime stories were actually the stories of saints. And so my mom would read me these stories of saints that gave unconditionally and selflessly. And I was raised with these ideals. And then in healthcare, I had to reconcile that these ideals couldn't always happen. So they're along the upward plateaus, and there's other images of figures turning away from those ideals, realizing they couldn't live up to those expectations. And this is along those same lines. I remember I continued to teach color theory for a long time. I teach presently at Northeastern Illinois University in Chicago. Now I teach different levels of painting. But at the time, I was teaching color theory there, and I was really struggling with this painting. And I remember giving a lecture on color schemes, and I was talking about how if you have a double complementary color scheme or a tetrad, those are tough color schemes to work with because the
Mhm,
colors can
mhm,
fight for attention. And I
mhm.
was saying to my class, I actually showed them this piece, an earlier version, and how I was struggling with it. And I said out loud to them, I'm like, if you have a difficult color scheme, have a color dominance. And if one color dominates, it's going to lessen that's tendency for chaos. And then I looked up this image happened to be on the screen, and it occurred to me that's where this had been failing at the time. So I worked back into it, and I brought the reflection of red back into the waves, so that I created more or less a red violet dominance, where I think that helped this work, where otherwise it had just been a chaotic mess. But this is one of those I struggled with. I think I worked about a year on this one.
Mhm.
But
And the size of the last couple
I
are
know this one, the last one, I'm pretty sure is 54 inches high.
mhm,
This one is close to 6 feet.
okay.
Like probably a 4.5 feet height. Have to look up the exact measurements, but this one's pretty big.
Are
And
these
then
last well, are these last couple of images, are they Chicago made, or were you still in Arizona at that time? Do you remember?
no, these were made in Chicago.
Chicago.
So, and there's actually a little sort of a funny story with this one. You saw my last apartment where I worked in my living room, and I was working on wood panel, and as you probably know, and your students probably are aware of this, but the bigger the piece, the larger the chance of it warping. And so this was so big, it was 6 feet. It was on wood panel, it had begun to warp. And so I hired someone to fix my warping issue. So he basically attached solid wood to the back of this painting, and it became so heavy, I couldn't lift it. And I had to get it to a show. I was having a show at the University of Wisconsin Parkside. And I was really stressed because I had to get it there on a weekday. I didn't know who I could ask on a weekday to take off work to help me lift this painting down the steps. And so it just so happens the Winter Olympics were on, and I was watching the luge runners, and I thought that's what I'll do. I'll take sandbags, and I'll load up a carpet on the top of my steps, and I'll slide my painting
Slide it. Yeah.
down just like the luge runners in the Olympics. So I was so proud of myself. I remember thinking, oh, I'm so smart. And I never had those thoughts, but I thought my idea was just brilliant. And the big irony of this is the day that I'm taking it to University of Wisconsin, the Olympics were on that day. And they were playing luge at that moment on my kitchen TV. So I dragged my artwork to the top of the kitchen steps. I had my rug loaded on the steps. Sandbags were in place. And at this moment, Al Roker comes on TV, and he's like, and luge runners build up speeds of 95 miles an hour. And it never occurred to me that something heavy will build up speed as you slide it down. So I hear him say that, and I was already at the tipping point. So I tipped my painting down to slide it down the stairs, and it built up speed. It slipped out of my hands.
Oh,
And then it went
no.
in the drywall, which you probably remember my back stairs. So then I end up yelling for my neighbor, Kathy, help. And she was a nurse, and she happened to be home that day, and she helped like pull it out of the drywall, and she helped me carry it out to the car. So be careful, just whatever you do. If you paint on a wood panel, there are other ways to unwarp it without attaching solid wood to the back. That's the moral of my story.
It's a good story.
Build crossbars, do it that way, but make sure you can lift it, and don't slide it down the steps. That as well.
Yeah.
So but yeah, this was done. I'm guessing the year might have been, oh gosh, I'd have to look. I think maybe around 2009-ish when I
Mhm,
did these.
mhm,
And this is along those same lines. I still went back to aspects of nature because I really felt that, yes, it's about me reconciling that I can't live up to these expectations, but I was also thinking about healthcare and these situations that were beyond my control. So I still kind of went back to that imagery that I found really powerful, but I was really working hard at varying the paint and using subtle glazes at some moments, and using the brush with the palette knife, and having more variance with how I applied the paint. And then this thing started to change for me too, because I've now been a therapist 28 years. And when I first started working as an occupational therapist, it was so much about my patients. But then the longer I worked, the
Mhm.
more I took note of the caregivers and I noticed what they were going through. And I start that shifted in my work too. So in this painting, you can see caregivers. If you look in the upper left-hand corner, there's a female figure hoisting an elderly person up to safety. But as she does so, she's going to be met by these vicious lions that she's surrounded by. But yet lions also represent courage symbolically. So I think with every act that's courageous, there's also such a risk that someone takes. And I was just starting to kind of delve into those themes with my new work. Um, and this is a little bit more recent. I want to say this is maybe 2000. 14, I think. Don't quote me on that, but around that time.
Mhm.
And this painting too is along those issues of caregiving. And I'm going to go to the next image. It's a detail. So if you on the upper right hand side, you can see a figure lifting someone out of the crevice of the cloud, and kind of similar, they fall back and they're met with the fate of these lions. And it was based on a story I remember my mom reading when I was young of Saint John of God. And Saint John of God saw someone drowning in a lake, so he jumped into the lake to save this individual who could not be saved. And then St. John of God ended up dying of pneumonia 2 days later. And I know this is a story from probably hundreds of years ago, but it's a story that still resonates with me when I'd see caregivers at the hospital and I'd work with the husband. And then a month later, I met their wife because she came in because of a back injury lifting her husband. I mean, there were so many cases where in the act of helping someone else, the person doing the caregiving also put themselves at physical and emotional risk. And I wanted to address that. And it's still something I that means a lot to me, and especially in my new work. And this was along these same themes of the saint-like expectations and the struggle to live up to those beliefs. And here too, on the right side, you can see figures that are holding other figures, and they're balanced so delicately on this construction equipment that's laid out. So one wrong move and they both will fall. And I feel that so summarizes what I'd see in the hospital so many times, where two people that are elderly are caring for each other. I'm grateful my mom, who cared for my dad before his passing, I'm so grateful she was not physically injured, but every day, every hour just seems so precarious. And I wanted to address that in these later pieces. And again, still playing with the idea of variants of paint, similar types of imagery. And these get to be a little bit more current. I have younger figures attempting to pull figures in wheelchairs, but yet those younger figures are embedded in the ground. And that's what I feel sometimes caregivers might go through. You can try with all your might to have an impact, but there are those elements beyond your control. But then again, I think I kept going back to the subject matter again and again and again, thinking it would help myself because I struggle with it so much. But in the end, I just ended up with more questions. But I think every painting was an attempt to find some sort of resolution. And this painting really was what changed so much for me and how I'm working today. So you can see figures on the bottom left. Some figures are saving others from drowning, and they climb up onto the rocks, and they both end up collapsing, as I remembered that story of Saint John of God from so many years ago. And I had a show at the Packer-Schopf Gallery in Chicago, and someone I greatly respect. His name's Tim Lowley, and he's in charge of the North Park University art program in painting. And he was so kind, and he came up to me and he listened to what I was saying about my work. And he said to me, "How does it feel that no one knows what you're saying?" And I thought, you know what, he is right. I mean, I had all this symbolism, I had all these narratives, but the fact of the matter, the fact they were so lost and embedded in the scenery, so much of what I was saying was not apparent. And I really wanted my meaning to be clear. And there's an artist I'm going to talk about the very end of my talk, Amy Cutler, and she has these really beautiful idiosyncratic narratives surrounded by white space. And she did so to draw more attention to her narrative. So when he said that, it clicked with me. And I just did a 180. I decided to focus on drawing because the meaning of what felt so important to me. And I didn't want that to be lost. So I went back to drawing, and this is a show I had, I believe, in 2015 at Firecat Projects in Chicago, really, really related to the struggles of caregiving. I wanted those individuals to be visible. And oftentimes when you're caregiving, you can be so attentive to some things, but yet there's other things lurking, other dangers you weren't aware of that aren't even in your visual field, aren't even something you've given thought to, but they're there and they encroach upon what you're
Right.
going.
Right. And it seems to me that when you're in the moment, the intensity of caregiving that lingers and you take it with you. I can't imagine that this is a kind of job that you can leave at your job. And and I think it shows in the work where you bring it with you in many different phases. These pieces technically, can you give us materials and a size for us?
Yeah, no, these are smaller. These are, I think they're 11 by 14 inches, and they're done on pastel paper. And I would tone them with sort of a sepia type of tone or red orange tone, or I think we all have a tendency for certain colors we're drawn to. And then I work back into them with soft charcoal pencils. I would think I dealt with like a 6B and a 4B, and then I used white chalk for the highlights. I see some yellow tones I added, and just inventing the imagery, inventing the narrative. And then I didn't realize it at the time, but I think a lot of these kind of fed into my current work, just working out these narratives and just thinking about like why I'm drawn to the subject matter so
Can you give
much.
us some, can you give us some, as you're going through, we'll keep going a little bit with the phrase working out the narratives. Can you give us some more specifics as to what that means, that process of how you're working it out and how it's not just really resolved in one image, but it's a complex, continual practice, both conceptually and certainly technically.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think for me, working out the narrative is when I say that, my initial thought was I didn't want to be an illustrator. Not that I have the highest respect for illustrators, but I didn't want to just copy a photograph of an image. I wanted to take the viewer to a new place. I want to be more inventive. I want to create questions in my work, some of the questions I have. So when I work out the narrative, what I mean by that is I'm trying to edit out things that maybe aren't necessary, but put enough in to raise these questions about these underlying dangers and what's going to happen next. And by having a large part of this background empty and editing it out, I'm hoping that I can leave a little bit more to the viewer's imagination. And then in terms also I think a lot of times in art, I've heard once there's a writer, I believe her name was Anne Patchett. She was interviewed on NPR, and she said everybody has one story. And it's when you get away from that one story, you kind of get in trouble. And she was talking about her books, and she was talking about how there's an interconnectedness with all of them. And I think with me, it's the struggle to live up to expectations. It's a struggle to accept what you can't change, but it's also a hope I have to bear witness to individuals such as caregivers that aren't always viewed or seen. And so I have these hopes with these drawings. And so when I do these little ones, I think my hope is that it builds up to something bigger and better in the future. And sometimes I don't know what that is, but I find I keep going back to some of these types of stories and I take elements from them. Like you've seen the boats in other paintings, instead of repeatedly drawing the boat, now I'm putting the caregiver with patient in a boat, and I have more of this underlying danger that's lurking beyond. And so I guess it's just a lifelong process of how to address what I hope to say within these works and how to do it without spoon feeding everything to the viewer. That answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
Um, so this one too, I was at the time that I made this drawing, my grandmother, my wonderful model, for all those years had started to fail. And as I mentioned, she broke her hip at age 97. And it was heartbreaking, to see her change in those last few years. And my aunt, who's disabled and had a brain tumor removed, she ended up being the caregiver for my grandmother. And my aunt walked with a limp. And I think a lot of what I'm saying also, I think back to my aunt's situation caring for my grandma, and I think now to my mom did caring for my father. And it can be so difficult seeing what a caregiver went through. I mean, you're literally bearing the weight of someone physically and metaphorically. And so I wanted to address that with this work. You see my aunt walk with this horrible limp, and using a walker, a cane, and then having to clean my grandmother. It was very, very difficult for her, and the toll it took on her health, I don't think could ever be described. But this is another way, and this sort of, I guess, working out the narrative, as I would say, I'm trying with this little story to uh, pay tribute to her physical and emotional struggle but having it be very open-ended too, and hopefully show the love, because you can't do something with that like that without an enormous amount of love.
And you know what? Let me say that you can keep toggling a little bit as we talk. I think that comes through in your work, in really your personality, the overall sense of this exceptional burden of love that you've placed upon yourself, and maybe also from your upbringing and the depths of Catholicism as well, and in that, and in my opinion, a kind of overburdened guilt that you've had on yourself to that's almost unfair to yourself. But your occupation, your profession, both as artist, as occupational therapist, and it really emanates from a sense and a power of compassion and care that emanates in the work throughout all of them, caring for your fellow woman and man, humanity, and then down to the specifics of those day-to-day relationships, your parents, your friends, and so on. And it emanates, I think, one of the dominant themes or subtexts, I think, of your work.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for saying that. Thank you.
Sure.
This work too, it's similar types of themes, but I also struggle. Um, I think of my grandmother and those last 3 years where she wasn't herself. She was a ghost of the person we all remembered. And then you see other patients, and they might be 10 or 11 years old, and they have terminal cancer, and they may not survive. And you have questions in your mind. Why is it that someone is given the luxury of living to be 100, but the last few years are so difficult and painful? But yet someone who's 10 that might have their whole life ahead of them, they're denied that. And why? And so for me, when I want to express like the darkest, deepest issues that I'm struggling with, I rely on symbolism that helps me. And so I've always been fascinated by the symbol of the turtle representing longevity. So I put the younger patient on a skeleton of a turtle, and then of course the older individual on this the turtle swimming through space. And I think that's just something that's always fascinated me. And if for the art students that are out there, if you can at some point take a vacation to the Getty Museum, there's an enormous amount of work just loaded with symbolism in those galleries, and that influence. I think I had seen the Getty and then did these pieces along with the Museum of Natural History in New York, and our Natural History Museum in Chicago too.
The Getty is you're talking about Los Angeles, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, that was what I just want to make sure.
Yes.
I was there when I was an undergrad, and then of course the Natural Museum in New York, one of my favorite natural museums, all the wonderful dioramas, the sculptures, and the background paintings there. Oh, the artists that put those, different prehistoric scene, caveman scene are just still, they're aged because now in our digital world, but they're still rich. They're really rich and gorgeous. If you would, Mary, give our audience a little specifics on your grandmother. She's amazing, 97 years old, that she survived to. What was her name?
Her name was Alice. Yeah, you'll see more images of her coming up where I focus on her, and this is her right now. And yeah, she was feisty and opinionated, but very, very giving. Showed her love through her actions and her generosity. Yeah, beautiful soul. And this was after she broke her hip, and I snapped this picture of her, and some I sometimes struggle with that because I don't know if she was aware. She did see me take her picture, but I do struggle that she didn't have the awareness she had, 15, 20 years prior, which was actively modeling for me. But in my mind, I thought, I'm going to pay tribute to you in this picture. And lilies are symbolic of purity. And so I have her surrounded by these lilies. And then I have this younger figure as the caregiver kind of seep down underneath the lilies. In some actions, reaching out for help where no help arrives. And in other motions, she seems to be, at peace with where she is. But yeah, she was an amazing lady. Yeah,
Mom's side or dad's side?
mom's side. Yeah, she lived. Um, so yes, she lived next door to my aunt, and then later in life, my aunt built a home next to hers, and they moved in together, and that's when my aunt became her caregiver before her passing. And I think on some level, I was thinking of my aunt in this piece because my aunt being disabled and toileting my grandmother and cleaning her and with this limp and the left side of her body being so weak, it's as if she was carrying with such danger surrounding her. So obviously I have the oxygen tank and the fires burning nearby to represent again the dangers and hardships that can come with caregiving. And this was based on photographs I had taken from the Museum of Natural History in New York. I loved birds for all the symbolism, for all the reasons I mentioned previously, but then to do a bird skeleton, to me, it just brought it to a new level. Jerry Saltz, the art critic, he just said on Instagram a day ago, like, artists always have your camera handy. Click, take photographs of whatever inspires you, whatever you see, because you never know how that can filter into new work. And I'm paraphrasing him, but I'd highly recommend that. I mean, these images that I took using natural history just felt right to put into these drawings. And I did that here too. The turtle skeleton is again from that museum. And then this is another, I think there's certain, when you go through lots of bodies of work, there's certain images that just change everything for you. And this drawing was at a show at the Detroit Museum of New Art. Now, it was a very unique show because they accepted everyone, and everyone in the show got a 15-minute critique with the art critic Jerry Saltz, who I just mentioned. And so I had this drawing on display, and when he looked at it, he said, I quote, "What's a carefully rendered drawing like this going to do in today's contemporary art world?" And I completely understood where he's coming from because even though my technique might be nice, I am really a follower of hundreds of thousands of artists that have come before me. There's nothing unique about my technique. My subject matter might be slightly unique, but there's nothing that sets this apart. And I really took to heart what he said. I thought it was right. I don't want to be a follower. In my own way, I'd like to be a leader. I want to create my own imagery. Getting back to even what Janice had said, like taking the viewer to a new place and being more inventive. And so he in that critique recommended I look at the drawings on glassine by Eric Fischl. And when he mentioned these to me, I looked at it that night on my iPhone. I was so excited I couldn't even sleep. I just thought these were the most beautiful things. And I didn't know how I was going to do them. I looked at them. I saw that his were pinned against the wall. I loved how he could intuitively work that way. From what I read, he claimed that these drawings were studies for paintings. I just think they're beautiful as they are. And so I took a stab at it and I studied these. This is another one by Eric Fischl. And then this is my first attempt working this way. And I pose, when you start off working with a new series, there's a whole series of questions that come up. How do I display it? How do I attach these images? I really didn't have the answers. I just knew I had to do it. So this is based on a saint. I'd have to research her name, but there was one saint gave her children away to someone else so that she could create a hospital for the poor. And I think that that was such an interesting narrative where you give up your own children to do something for a greater good. Was that the right decision? Did her children, did, how did they feel? Although then she may have had an impact on hundreds of people. It's just raised to that question when you're giving, at what detriment can it come with, and this balance between giving and receiving, and can there be a balance? And there's so many elements beyond our control. So that's where this drawing stemmed from. Was my first drawing on glassine, and I really didn't know how to arrange it. And then I happened to have a show coming up at the Hofheimer Gallery in Chicago, and sometimes like deadlines and circumstances, you're forced into making decisions. So to have
Mhm.
this work on display, I had to put them in a frame. That really wasn't what I initially intended. I want to be more like Eric Fischel, but the paper which I have here, I know, I kind of see it. This is what glassine looks like. It's very
Mhm.
thin, it's very flimsy, rips that wrinkles so easily. I
Is it,
couldn't.
is it a lot like vellum?
Yes, it's a lot like vellum, but
And
I
then the also, sorry, the materials with which you're drawing upon the glassine are.
oil, and that poses its problems because with these particular images on glassine, I'm not sure, in 50 or 100 years what's going to happen. But I knew that I couldn't make these works with acrylic. I couldn't. There's something about oil and that wet into wet mixing and working subtractively when the paint's wet and wiping it away. And I really wanted to do that. There was no other way to do it. And so for me, I just did it anyway. And this is about those patients that I had at the hospital. And I've had so many where they fell and they couldn't get up, and they're lying there sometimes for 1 to 2 days waiting and hoping that they will be found. And I often thought that was one of the more heartbreaking things anyone could endure. And there are many patients that aren't found. There, in the obituaries, there's a story behind every person, and it's heartbreaking to say. But when I started off working at St. Louis University Hospital, that was before those life alert buttons. It was before people had their iPhones that they would attach to themselves. It was a different era, and there are many patients that had fallen, and imagine how you're feeling and your life is passing before you in this state. So I was thinking about that in these works and using the glassine to create more ghost-like layers to show, the fading of this person, and maybe she's seeing the transition from this life into the next. Maybe she's living that in her mind. I don't know, but the glassine just seemed to be a good way to work if I'm trying to address the absence of self that can happen with dementia, the absence of self that can happen with certain degenerative diseases. This seemed like the best way to work for me. And you were
How large are these?
this one. Well, I just put it away in my closet. I would guess this one would be about. I'm always guessing. I have a catalog here. I can find out the answer in just a second. This image is 28 by 33 inches. So they're like medium size,
Yeah,
and
it's a
and
nice size. That's a nice size. Yeah.
they're,
And I'm
and this
assuming
is
they're
inches
they're
like
pretty light too. And then do you mount them on a white backing of sorts, or they go right on the wall?
yeah. So because the paper's so thin and so fragile, um, I yeah, I couldn't, I had to frame them. I mean, there's no way around it. So I put it in a backing with like a foam core, white foam core, and then I have a mat around it because the issue with glassine, as the paint dries, and because the paint is so thin, as the paint dries, it pulls the paper in and it creates wrinkles in the paper. So
Mhm.
it's less likely to wrinkle if you put it under a mat. So I put the paper and I tacked it on the edge with archival tape and put a mat over the top and then framed it. And I had to contact, yes, it's a great question, but I had to contact the Conservation Society in Chicago. I think it's the Conservation Center on feedback on how to frame these. But
Mm.
that's the best way to eliminate more of the wrinkling, which isn't entirely bad because
It'd be fascinating as another textural metaphor. That's interesting.
You're right, and it didn't occur to me at first, but you're absolutely right. Like I heard after graduate school that your medium should support your artwork, and I that was such a great statement. I heard it at an artist residency, and that's so true. And the fact that this paper does wrinkle, the fact that this paper is fragile and thin, it comes to mind the individuals I'm trying to represent. So you're absolutely right. It kind of became a happy accident when it would wrinkle. And this is my grandmother. This is when probably in the early 2000s when she was able to pose for me. And this is her posing also, standing in her kitchen pretending she's dancing. And just I
Mm.
love collage. I think it creeps up in my new work even more, but just the idea of I love the idea of trying to figure out what's in front, what's behind. So, I took the hand from the back, cut it out, put it in front of the glassine paper that's layered over the oil painting, and then dealt with these shards, and what is she seeing, or she's seeing herself. Oops, sorry, wrong one.
When you're drawing, you're making these works. Are you making them with, I'm assuming, brush?
I initially draw them with fine charcoal because it's so light. And I have an image coming up in the PowerPoint of my process. So I
Mhm.
draw them with fine charcoal. And then once I have a light contour line that I can wipe away very easily, then I go ahead and go in them with the paint.
Mhm.
And if you look closely in this one, there's a slit on the right side in her arm. So where that slit is, I took paper from behind and put it over the top. So if you have to look carefully, but there's a hand that's on top and then a hand that's painted
Oh
behind.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that was fun for me. I always thought, okay, if I'm going to follow that advice, like the medium might support my work. What is it about that medium? What can I do with glassine to make it more interesting? And then this was, I think this might be the last painting in that series, but because of the fragility of glassine, I started working on Duralar, which I
That gets
have
to the
right
vellum.
here.
Yeah,
Much
yeah.
thicker, I don't know what all you can see in here, but much thicker.
Right.
There's
It's a wonderful. I've had my students work on that particular material in my advanced classes for some years. I haven't lately, but I love that material as well. And I've never used glassine, so I'm going to investigate for my students on that. This is an intriguing image. You've got that layered middle, something abstract. It reminds me of bovine animal, maybe a little bit, but also almost kind of a continent type of shape. Can you talk a little bit about this layering effect here?
Yeah, so this one I took the glassine and I knew that if the glassine would wrinkle with time. Again, not entirely a bad thing, but I just wanted it to be a little less that direction. So I cut out the images of glassine and I layered them on Yupo paper. And I cut out a silhouette of a bird skeleton from
Hmm.
the Museum of Natural History in New York. And then what's behind the front figures, if you look carefully on the two sides, you can see the glassine paper, but what's behind them is drawings of my grandmother on the Duralar. And so the Duralar is like the furthest to the back, and then the glassines over that, and they're mounted on that Yupo. And this was just an image where I'll be brutally honest. I needed another work for my show, and I had these scraps laying around. I had images of my grandmother, and I had initially tried to arrange the images for dancing in one piece, and it wasn't working. And I saw these scraps. I saw the silhouette I had cut out for this collage. And I had all these other images of my grandmother on Duralar. I thought I'm going to just see. I'm going to put these all together and just see what happens. And it's just one of those images that just work, and it's a one-off. I don't have any others like this, but I am proud of how it turned out. And once,
Fascinating.
don't give up, like, save your scraps. You never know when those little scraps can turn into something.
Right, right, right. Hmm.
um and so then, oh, I guess I had a couple more. This image, I was thinking of the women falling and then they're not found for 1 to 2 days.
Yeah, that's
uh,
also fascinating, this semi-blurred image that pushes the depth back, and then we get the more clear image in those greens, those kind of bruising kind of greens. in the foreground with those figures tumbling but also laying down are pretty fascinating. And they inhabit these worlds that are very vague, and they don't have a perspectable space. So there's a really intuitive, that's not the right word, they're ambiguous spaces of what's up, what's down. These figures might be upside down. We don't necessarily know. So they could be really experiencing a tumbling chaos in a world of where are we kind of experience. That's probably more poignant in my mind than if you had rendered a floor, a bed, curtains, and something where we have a staid kind of experience of context. Without the context makes it even more, I think, more whirling and chaotic.
Thank you. That's a great point. I agree with you. Thank you. And this is again getting back to caregiving, and I cut these images out of the glassine, and I mounted them on Duralar so that the as you know the paper wouldn't pull in as much. And I'm trying to remember how I mounted them. I think I bought an archival glue. And this too, this is called Waiting. Still, that it's just that issue of the women that are hoping to be found. It's just was such a hard thing to see in healthcare.
Mm-hmm.
And then the element, I remember this is when the lips happened, and when you wore the special glasses. And I just thought it was a beautiful image, and just representing caregivers that are trying to find safety when there's elements beyond your control. Mm-hmm. Oops, wrong direction. Okay, this leads to the new work, which is about my mom caring for my father before his passing. So I think the symbolism, her being underwater, is pretty self-explanatory, but I do get questions about the trays. And my mom would bring my father dinner and breakfast, lunch, and dinner on a tray, because the last year of his life, he was more or less chair bound. And that really was the highlight of his day, were these meals. And so the trays became such a positive aspect of his day. So my mom is holding him up on trays, but I like the fact that the trays are transparent, where at any moment they could fall through, knowing the risk she put herself under. And what was so hard, and I know we can all relate to this, but I wasn't able to get home because this was done in 2000. It was based on 2020. It was done in the last year or two, but it's during the pandemic. I couldn't get home because I was working at the hospital, and we were having so many exposures. There were a lot of exposures we weren't told about, and it was pre-vaccine. So my mom said, "I don't want you to come home yet. It's too risky."
Right.
So
Wow.
her a lot, and I heard her tears and how difficult it was and what she was going through, and the frustration and just the loneliness. It was heartbreaking not to be able to get home. And so that's more or less, of course, where the underwater nature comes from. And then the positive aspect of his day being these trays. And for this,
and again, these are probably close to life size, I'm guessing.
Yes, these are on Duralar, because for all
cut out, right? How did you mount them to the wall?
I mount them with little pins, and I've done this different ways. Pins that are just about like a half centimeter high, and they have a little white head to them. Mm-hmm. And I one show, I think when I showed at the Evanston Art Center, I removed the pin heads because I wanted them to be just plus against the wall. I wanted to, in working subtractively and having them against the whiteness of the wall, I wanted to show my dad's disappearance, because he was becoming, just like my grandmother, a ghost of the person we had remembered. And so I didn't want anything to interfere with that disappearance with the artwork. Mm-hmm. However, when I had a show at Concordia University, she wanted me to put the ends of the pins in. I think primarily she was worried about a student rubbing up against the edges and getting scratched. But she also said, I like using those pins because they remind me that they're like specimens. They're things we're studying. So I think that's a valid point. I personally kind of like it a little better without the ends of the pins, but I think there's some validity, and there could be an equal argument being said for keeping the little pinheads in. So
what's fascinating, and maybe let's go to the next one if you want, is that when I look at those, there's no cast shadowing that you get sometimes from the attachment process. You get those slightly bleak class shadows. Maybe we're not close enough, or maybe the lining is flooded in many different directions, so it gives a flattening but they sit just beautifully. And I think, to me, when I look at the work and where you started changing your work after that critique, or right before that critique with the drawings and the pastel paper, to me, this is all that was building to this apex of these, larger, enriching, engaging pieces, but on a life size, scale. It's good to see. This is probably your biggest work, correct, too, right?
Yeah, these are life size. This spans the length of a long wall. I'd have to look at the exact measurements, but I want to say the figures for my dad are, those are like 80 some inches high at least. So, and I think the length of the wall, gosh, I want to say it's like 120 inches long roughly.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, and that's true for the students, um, even my early work of those landscapes, I have no interest in working that way again. But I do think every work you make does lead up to your more mature work. And I do have a fascination with, how layered can I make it and have it still make sense? Like there's still that part of me conceptually. I am, although they're surrounded by white wall, there's still an intense layering process that's just what I enjoy doing. And so don't ever think that a series failed you, because it leads to other things. If anything, you realize what you don't want to do, or you realize what doesn't work. It can lead to something better if you keep at it.
Well said. Well spoken.
And then this one too, my mom, prayed so hard for my dad's recovery. She even, would look up saints. She would look in alphabetical orders of all the saints listed in history and find the saints with the most obscure names, like Saint Walburga and Saint Epiphanius. And she would pray to see these saints from that no one's heard of, thinking they'd be more likely to hear her prayer. And so I had to pay tribute to that. And there's a part of me that just so admires her faith, but of course the other part of me working in healthcare realizes, sometimes you have to work on the concrete elements, researching the right doctors, researching the right medications to make a difference, and that my viewpoints are echoed in the skeleton that's behind the saint. But I could not do this series without touching on that. And as time went on, the saint becomes a little bit smaller. And of course, this is when my dad, he fell many times, but her relying on prayer, and she becomes larger as the saint becomes smaller, because so much is put on her shoulders, especially in the pandemic when it was really all on her.
It's also interesting how the rendering of the figures in this new material has become, they're almost like steel. They're almost metallic, and they have a glistening kind of slightly metal quality. Almost slightly reminds me a little bit of Philip Pearlstein, the smoother phase of his career, some of the larger one that's really polished and a little bit, rendered, at least from a distance too, as well. When you're cutting out the figures, I'm assuming, some of those spots where there's, in your kneeling mother, there's negative space in her nose, in her arm area. And so you're gently cutting out there. How delicate is the material once you have it? Is it kind of flimsy and then you mount on the wall, and then, storage kind of things when they're not being shown?
It's been pretty durable. The thing I have to be careful with, and I'm learning this now as I'm getting into the series, is I store them on big, not in tubes, but they're right over here to my right. I take poster boards from the dollar store and I tape them together because they're more durable than paper. And then I put them on paper, which maybe I'm going to fast forward here just a minute. So you can see this paper, hanging on my studio wall. So what I did previously is I would put them on paper and I would roll them up. But if I'm not careful, if I accidentally step on the paper, it gets pushed against the wall or something falls on it, the Duralar will fold. And then I'll end up with the crease. That's when the work that's happened. I don't think they've ever torn, but I have a few spots in some of these works where I have the crease. So now you can't really, well, yeah, you can't really see this, but to my left over here, I've got all these tubes where that I've made with poster board, and I found that to be a lot more durable.
And then let's stop here for just a moment. So these look like they are these works where the underlay is with vine charcoal. Is that correct? And so,
Correct.
and these are pretty sketchy. And then they wind up being, let's go. I think we've seen this image, at least the one on the left prior, right? Yes. And they wind up being these more rendered. They're not photographically rendered, of course, but they have a smoother quality. So I'm assuming the vine charcoal finds a way to be subsumed within the oil or just whisked off. Correct. Yeah. Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah. And the Durlar, for those of you that are not familiar, is just, it's so engaging. It's got this wonderful smooth quality, but it has a little tooth to it where it can suck in the material. I'm fascinated how you're using it as well. I love, if you want to go back to the studio shot, what resonates, making such personal work, and also right in one's home. There's something about having your studio at home. And I personally have missed that for years. I've had my studio in a building here in right off, not quite downtown Cincinnati, but a place that's called Northside. And I've since moved. I've a home studio now. And then I've used my office as a studio too. So I have they're small, but together they're big. But there's also that nice quality of being able to go in, grab a sandwich, and do laundry, and then come back and you're going. You've probably experienced all that. Like, I got a load of laundry towels or whatever, and then all of a sudden I'm rendering, a towel or something related to that which you're doing almost immediate. So it's really home bound in a positive way, where it's really that entire world that it's authentic. There's nothing fake or I think overpressed or pretentious about your work that I think resonates through. For me, it always really has. In a world full of self-aggrandizement and monetary overvalue, your work is distinctive.
Well, thanks, Mark. And for those of you, we all struggle with studio space, and obviously I don't have the wall space, and I like to go back and forth and see how does this going to relate to this piece. So initially I would layer these pieces of paper on my studio wall, and then I would like work. You could see the one woman behind. I would flip it up and then work behind and then work on the one overlying. That's so I could kind of work on multiple big pieces at once. And then my easel, which is behind me, if I did
Right. Yep. We can see it pretty good.
work, and then I kind of bounce over to the wall. I use my wall as an easel, so that's been really helpful.
Mhm.
And let's see. Oops. Let me go forward here. So this is another different version of how I work. Another thing I do is I actually pose myself as my mom, because I didn't want her to get down in these difficult situations and poses. So
That's you. I knew that. I thought that the mom. I didn't know if there was an age difference, or maybe you were playing off a younger age for your mother and then your father in his natural age. But now I see you've got a wig on, I'm assuming, correct? Fascinating.
Yes.
Oh my goodness.
Yes, that is me. That's the truth.
Yeah.
And so this is like, these are the things people don't always see when they see a show. But so I had my mom photograph me because I wanted her to be a part of the work. And then my boyfriend John posed as my dad, because my dad has since passed. And so I would take Xerox copies and my drawings, and I layer them, and I try to work on a different arrangement. So here's kind of like 3 images on the right in process that are based on my photographs. And the very top one, you can see it's partially painted, partially done in vine charcoal, and then it finds its way into the piece. And now, yeah, I've changed it since then. I don't know if I've got the final version in the PowerPoint, but this posed a problem because I really wanted this piece to be high. I just really wanted to show just the difficulties of caregiving, and and what my mom was literally lifting my father during the pandemic. I don't know how she did it. It was pure love. I remember hearing a story one time of a mother whose son was was run over by a car, and the mother lifted up the car because she loved her son.
Yeah.
So I don't know. It was pure love. And so I had to show the magnitude of that. But I didn't have a 12-foot wall. My walls are 10 feet high. And so I had to work on it horizontally, and I had to keep tipping my head. And then I would take pictures on my iPhone and then flip it up. And so you can see when it's flipped up, the one on the right is imbalanced. And the argument could be said, well, isn't that okay? It's about imbalance. But I actually did want it balanced. I just wanted a visually balanced piece. So I worked on it since then. And yeah, this is the final version. So the one on the left is how it was at Concordia University, my recent show. And that was professionally photographed. Their walls are 10 feet high. The one on the right is how it will be on display at a show coming up at the Epiphany Center for the Arts, which has a 12-foot high ceiling. And I wanted an end to it. Just like I remember one time Nicole Kidman was interviewed, and she's like, when you talk about a scary movie, the ending is everything. And I think for sometimes an artwork too, an artwork like this, it's the ending that was so important. So in the final version, her gaze meets my father, but his head is tipped back and his hand is tipped back, and you can see an echoing as he becomes there's the evanescence of the person he was. And I still might attach one more arm up there. I'm playing with that, but I'm gonna thankfully have this showing. And I heard another great quote I heard once is just, don't worry so much about constraints of like money and space and how you're going to present it. Just make the work you want to make. So I made this piece not knowing if I would ever find a 12-foot high wall to show this on, but it did happen. And I would just say that, do it. And things sometimes fall the way they're meant to be. And if any of you are on Instagram, I have an Instagram page. It's Mary.Porterfield. And you can see the video of how I'm videoing it from like bottom to top horizontally, and then how I flip it up. You can see some of the process photos there.
Are there many different pieces to this image that you kind of hang together, or is it one large piece that's cut out?
It's multiple pieces that are spliced together, and it's now held together with archival tape.
Right.
And so this is probably the hardest piece I've done. Not harder emotionally, just harder to make the piece I wanted to make. I mean, there's truth to like sometimes the bigger the piece, you have more variables, and it's hard to have it all come the way you want. And I still have a little spot I'm not entirely satisfied with that I think could change. But yeah, this one took a full year to do.
These pieces belong in health centers. They belong as a reminder of our humanity and our struggle to find the proper care and time and the strength to care for one another in an overly, really, in my opinion, capitalized world. And what happens when you don't have the funds, and then all that crushing weight of that comes down on you too. So, and then the industrial complex of healthcare, all of that is coming through, in my opinion. The burden that the woman below, the metaphor of you and your mother that you guys take on. I think this is some of your most powerful work, and it's ambitious. And the evolution for my students, I want them to be very mindful of where you started, and then where you're at kind of mid career. And we are really, as we've talked about off camera, where we are with caregiving that got thrust into my life just recently, and of course where you've been and where you're going to be, where we're both headed, for that is extremely timely. And I read an article in the New York Times yesterday about young men and women in their mid-20s that were already thrust into worlds of shock, where they've had to pick up at such a tender age when they're just starting their careers. It is I don't know if it's a failing of our society, but it's certainly a poignant one now for us. Powerful. Keep going.
Thank you. And thanks for acknowledging that. I get asked sometimes, why are you doing this? And it means a lot to me to let these individuals be seen, not just the patient, but the caregiver. And you've given me that opportunity, and I so appreciate what you just said.
Mhm.
Um, this is for those painting students out there. This was inspired by,
Oop, we lost your.
pardon me?
There you go. We lost your
Oh,
mic there for a
sorry.
second. There you go.
These are inspired by paintings by Thomas Cole, a Hudson River School artist, and he had, I believe it was 4 or 5 paintings called Course of an Empire. And in the beginning painting, it starts out, Earth begins, and it's beautiful and it's exciting. Then man enters the picture. It's also beautiful. And then there's a painting where man and nature live harmoniously. And then the next painting, man starts to destroy nature and destroys itself. And there's fires and there's wars and there's a lot of difficulty. And then the final painting, nature lives on. And so my dad passed, and my mom literally has a mountain of medical equipment, commodes, wheelchairs, urinals, the hospital bed, the sit-stand device, it goes on and on and on, multiple canes, multiple different types of walkers. And I painted some of these walkers green, really thinking of those series of paintings that when the soul has passed, it's the items, it's the things that are left behind. And that's something I wanted to address. And I'm a big fan of just keep getting feedback. I've used this pandemic as an opportunity to have critiques with individuals I've respected. And Dan Devening, who, if you're in the Chicago area, might know of him. He teaches at SAIC. So kind to critique my work. And he said, think of your paintings like a play. What would the backdrop be? And that's something I really took to heart. I think he had an excellent point. I love the figure, but I don't always want to do the figure. What else can I put in these stories that aren't so illustrative? What else can I add to develop this narrative where it's still raising more questions than answers? So this is pretty recent, and this is one I'm going to keep working on. I'm going to have a show at the Miller Art Museum in Sturgeon Bay, Wisconsin, and I'm really excited about it. And I'm going to add to this with crutches, and things still get back to a good composition. And when I look at this, I would still like to bring in an area of greater density. Like we were taught, Mark and I, in grad school, good work reveals itself slowly. And I think there's a point where I can vary the density even more with this. So this is in progress, but it's fun where every time I show it, I can show it differently.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's modulated too. It becomes a slightly different piece. You could really explore design in the overall aesthetic, positive, negative space, and that wonderful interaction in those boundaries as we move and go up and down and through, and then that interplay between those interesting rectangles and that rectilinear kind of quality. So to be clear, let's make it clear for our audience that your mother, throughout your ending days for your father's life, did she provide all of the health care at their home?
Yes, every bit of it. I will say, like you brought up a good thing about finances, and we were very, very lucky because my dad was a veteran, and the VA in Omaha went above and beyond. They were they were so good to him,
As
and
they should be, right?
they gave him everything he needed. They allowed this to happen, and he had home nursing, and he had my mom had a caregiver help, I think 6 days a week for 2 hours. I will say that, but most of it fell on her. And she even had a Hoyer lift. If I don't know if anyone's familiar with that, but it's like a giant sling, and you put your loved one in the sling and you push a button and it raised your loved one up. And that's how she was able to move my father to the chair when he was unable to stand. And even maneuvering that is very difficult. And she did it on carpeting, and she's 5'1", but it was all just a testimony to her love. It amazes me what she did.
Wow.
And I'm looking at the time. For those of you wondering, we're nearing the end here, but this is my last show. And I remember when I started working on Dural art, an artist that I respect said, Mary, if you're going to use the wall, use the wall.
Mm-hmm.
And that always
Mm-hmm.
stuck with me. And so this is, of course, my mom went through a great deal of loneliness caring for my father because he couldn't really converse towards the end. He was giving yes, no responses. So she's alienated in this picture, and I used electrical tape, and I think I have it written down. 220 inches long. And so I have, you can see the electrical tape. So she's attempting to kind of pull the wall, but of course the wall is stationary. And you can see in the top image, she looks up and her eyes gaze and meet a dead end, because I think my mom was continually trying to exercise with my father and trying to create change where change was not possible. And she didn't give up till the very end.
Right.
And
There's something about this piece. This is one of my favorites. There's so many pieces that I've enjoyed in evolution, but something about that tape, that angle, the length of it, pulling down, the eye movement there, and then the tape from the corner coming down to the really the body of the entire figures, and then the younger version looking back up to get back up to the almost the above part of that lower level. And then of course the different ages there is pretty powerful. And then one other thing, when I was at Art Center here in Los Angeles, a little plug in, I've got my school I teach at in my undergrad years here.
Yep.
The transportation department, which was fascinating to watch. I was illustration and fine art. They every year during their semester towards the middle to end, they would do these black tape drawings on the wall for aerodynamics of their cars, and they were about this size, and they used all black tape. They were
wow.
fascinating. I think you've opened up, at least in my opinion, another avenue for layering with the black tape, perspectival spaces, but yet still are voids with the white wall. And you could, you have, convergence lines and perspectival space, and then, floors and depth, and some things that you as you evolve and explore, I think is another avenue for you. And then may even be color in between the spaces of the shapes that you make. And what's fascinating, once the show's over, of course the tape is taken off the wall, and there's probably a little sanding, and you've got your next show, and you can explore what happens in the next show slightly different, so the piece can be changed a little bit. That's what I love about these modular, what I call modular pieces, that I've taught a little bit in my advanced classes, is that each time you display it or show it, exhibit it, right, can be a little bit, changed, and you're not bound by a hard wood structure, or as soon as you mount your canvas to wood supports, or if you're working on steel or metal, you've, like my prior work when I was in grad school, as you remember, it's kind of have my own personal Stonehenge, the ones that aren't sold or whatever. So it is fascinatingly more mobile, but really as a matter of fact, I would argue that your current work is even more powerful and poignant than the latter work. It just keeps getting and growing and getting better.
Thanks, Mark. I
Yeah.
appreciate that. I'm just thinking about that comment you made, and that is something I like to explore is coloring aspects of the wall. Because even in my studio, my wall is painted kind of an off-white, and I think that color plays a lot into aging, and even you think parchment, and you think about how the skin changes color, and there's just so much to do, so little time. But yeah, I like that idea. Thank you. And then with this one too, something else I explored that I should have done a detailed slide for you, but my mom lost 20 pounds caring for my dad. So if you look very, very carefully, there's a skeleton that I drew with paper. You see it's the humerus, the radius, the ulna, and that
Oh,
and the
yeah.
arm that's closest to us. And then the elderly woman behind, there's a skull that I drew lightly, because I wanted to show she too was disappearing. Like it literally took every ounce of her being to do what she had done. It was really over a really hard 2-year period, but more or less 4 years overall. And then this gets back to the critique I had, and these are in process. I want to preface that, but thinking about not just relying on the figure, thinking about those backdrops, what enhances the story. And my dad had no accessibility to nature. His last year, other than a rare doctor's appointment that was a lot of trouble to get him out of the house, we had to hire help. He sat in his easy chair that would electronically raise, and he could look out the patio window. And later, I don't really know what he saw, because he had multiple strokes. He had, with the Parkinsonism, there was a level of where his cognition was fading. I think he couldn't see well out of one eye because of the strokes. I think there were some multiple visual issues. So I often wondered, what was he seeing? And over the patio doors hung a curtain that had a pattern on it. And to me, the pattern on that curtain became his nature because he couldn't go outside. So I basically placed that pattern and put it opaquely over the where the glass would be for the windows, and brought nature into him, because maybe in his mind he was seeing some aspects of nature. Maybe it was inventive, maybe it was from memory. We really don't know. But his vision was largely what was close to him, and that was my mother, and seeing the hands and maybe the memory of what was, and just playing around with these. I think this is, as someone said to me, this is one of the more playful of the windows. But getting back to the comment that Mark and I had in grad school, that a good work reveals itself slowly. I am in the process of going back into these and adding darkened flowers to cover up the windowsill, because to me the windowsill is pretty quickly red, and windows are a pretty obvious metaphor, and it's not about all that. But if I really get to the heart of what I'm saying, I don't know what my father could see at the end, and I don't know if even this patio was even that clear to him. So this final window that's coming up, this is one that I work back into. It's actually behind me right now. So
Yeah.
you can kind of see how I've gone back in. I've added like darkened flowers, and forgive me, it's not professionally photographed. I just snapped it on my iPhone, but I took little aspects of some of the pattern from the outside and overlapped it on the windows. And I would like the windows to gradually be disappearing, just as what was in front of him slowly disappeared. And in closing, I'm just going to mention a few artists that greatly inspired me. I already mentioned Amy Cutler because of the whiteness of her background. That whiteness drew attention to these very idiosyncratic narratives. That was a tremendous influence on me. I adore her work. Trenton Doe Hancock, I've met him. I saw his work at the Studio Museum of Harlem. He has the most inventive, uninhibited narratives I think I've ever seen. I love his work. I love the complexity of it and the layering. And he said in his artist talk, don't be afraid to go places you're scared of. And that rings true with what I
Yeah.
do today.
He's pretty fascinating. He actually went to, he's much younger than I am. He went to the same place I started my undergraduate work at East Texas State University, which is actually Texas A&M Commerce. And
Yes.
he's a pretty big name in the art world. So he's a fascinating younger, well, man. And it's lovely. We walked the same structures, but probably a decade or two, after I left Texas or East Texas State and went on to Art Center. And he's made a wonderful career for himself. And his work is quirky, strange and inventive. And yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned him.
And I heard one of my coworkers from Northeastern says, great art is when you make something that only you can make. I mean, there will never be another Trent Doe Hancock. And those of you that are out there listening, if you like comic book art, check his work out. His origins are from drawing comic books, and he just takes it to a new level. And he touches on some racial topics also that are very, very powerful. And of course, I have to mention Henry Darger.
Yeah. Yeah, I
From
remember talking to him all the time in grad school. Yep.
Oh gosh, I love his work so much. Just uninhibited narratives. He would be a whole he would be like an hour conversation and that would just be a tip of the iceberg. But again, very idiosyncratic, very interesting, very unfiltered. And that's what happens when you do work for your own eyes. And more or less that's what he did. And I have to mention Swoon. I flew out. Mark, I would have contacted you, but it was a one-day trip. I flew out in the morning to see her show at the Contemporary Art Center, Cincinnati.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And flew back that night. And it was one of the best shows I had ever seen. I absolutely love the layers of her work. I was absolutely mesmerized. I walked around that show so many times. One of the guards said, "Do you want to sit down?" Because I just looked over and over and over again. She just completely blows my mind. I'm so enamored. And you talked earlier, Mark, about colors behind certain forms. I mean, here's an example of someone that does it in such an interesting way. And that is a new avenue to explore with this. And I'll end with William Kentridge. I had his quote earlier, but in case you're not familiar with his work, I think the way his drawings become animated is so incredibly powerful, and I love the subject matter. So
Yeah.
with that, I talked quite a while, an hour and a half, but I appreciate this opportunity, Mark. I so appreciate you having me, and I just adore you and your work, and thank you so much for this day.
Well, thank you very much, Mary. But on behalf of U2 Land, certainly, but then even more specifically, the School of the Arts and then the drawing area of Northern Kentucky University, we thank you and are honored for your time and your expertise and your, again, always give great, really clear, in-depth artist talks. So we're better for it. And Mary, we certainly appreciate you. So thank you again. And thank you everybody for joining us for this lecture series. And we'll see you next time. Take care and keep drawing. Bye-bye.